If the 90s were all about progress and progression, the new millennia would spring into existence shrouded in fear and paranoia. The first seconds of the year 2000 had the entire world waiting with bated breath. The monster that held us hostage? Y2K.
1999, I remember Y2K frenzy, and I was a freshman in high school. That's about all I remember from 19.
Y2K. The world apparently was going to explode, or maybe all the financial systems would get shut down. World War III, I don't know. The possibilities were endless.
The worry was, in short, almost every computer system at that time identified the date by using the last two digits of the year. Programmers worried that computer systems would not be able to distinguish the year 2000 from the year 1900, causing the system to crash. Fear ran rampant. People feared everything from a financial collapse, world war, and yes, as ridiculous as it may sound, a robot takeover. But as clocks struck midnight around the world, the fear of Y2K dwindled and the panic subsided. That sense of calm would be shattered on the clear morning of September 11th. Terrorists would launch an attack like nothing ever seen on U.S. soil.
What's that? Holy fuck! Oh my god! Oh my god!
4 planes were hijacked by 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists. 3 of these planes would deliberately crash into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The 4th plane would crash in a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people would die in the 9/11 attacks. Still reeling from the devastation of the 9/11 attacks, the public was given yet another thing to fear. On October 15, 2001, packages containing the deadly powder form of anthrax were delivered to news stations and public officials. 22 people would develop infections due to inhaling the deadly spores, 5 of which would die. Offices in the House and the Senate would need to be closed for a period of time. It would later be determined that the mail attacks were not related to those of 9/11. The country as a whole was suffering from a kind of PTSD. So much had happened so early into the new century. Just over a year later, on Wednesday, October 2nd, 2002, a fresh horror would captivate America and terrorize the community. At 6:30 p.m., 55-year-old computer analyst James Martin was shot and killed in the parking lot of a grocery store.
I remember a lot of what the initial reports looked like.
Here's what we do know about the shooting victims. James Martin, 55 years old, was shot last night at the Shoppers Food Warehouse.
Mr. Martin's death would be the first link in a chain of sniper attacks in the D.C. area. To understand how and possibly why this happened, we must go back to the early 80s. In 1983, a 23-year-old John Allen Williams would meet his future second wife, Mildred Green, while serving in the National Guard in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On the docu-series Monster in My Family, Mildred describes John as being a romantic and loved by his friends. John began serving in the National Guard in 1978, right out of high school. He had ambitions on joining the Army, but he had trouble reading, which prevented him from being able to enlist. Mildred would help John with this problem, and with her help, he would be able to enlist into the Army in 1985. His new career would require him to move from Baton Rouge to Washington State, but he would not leave the love of his life behind. John would ask Mildred to leave her home in Baton Rouge to start a new life with him in Washington. Mildred happily said yes, and the young couple would be married in 1988. Over the next few years, John and Mildred would add a boy and 2 girls to their growing family. John, now John Mohammed, was a dedicated family man who loved to spend time with his kids. He stayed involved in their lives, ensuring that they were happy and well cared for. The Muhammad household came under strain when John's unit was to be deployed to Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Storm. A military deployment for a soldier is always hard for a military family, and John knew the risk that he would be facing. Being the planner that he was, he sat down with his wife, and together they planned for the worst. John Muhammad left his young family behind and went to serve his country. Little is known about his time in Saudi Arabia.
Well, when you first mobilize and go into where the combat, they fly you into a safe area, or what's assumed to be safe. When we actually crossed into Iraq, I was scared as hell.
According to a Times.com article published in October of 2002, one of John's former captains was quoted as saying he was not a standout soldier. He also referred to John as a screwball who often found himself in trouble. However, during my research, I did find that John Muhammad earned the Army Achievement Medal.
It is awarded to any member of the armed forces of the United States or any member of the armed forces of a friendly foreign nation who, while serving in any capacity with the Army, distinguished himself or herself by meritorious service or achievement of a lesser degree than required for award of the Army Commendation Medal under the following circumstances. Number 1. After August 1st, 1981, for meritorious service or achievement while serving in a non-combat area. Number 2. On or after September 11, 2001, for non-combat, meritorious achievement or service.
Why he received this medal, like most of this case, is shrouded in mystery. If John was not a standout soldier, why was he awarded this medal? Reports vary on whether he saw combat while deployed. Some have him in small clashes with the enemy forces at the Saudi border. Other reports have him clearing chemical weapons from enemy bunkers, but most reports say he didn't see any action at all. What they all could agree on was that John Muhammad was a hell of a shot. He qualified with his M16, earning an expert marksman's badge. This meant he was able to hit at least 36 of 40 targets at ranges from 25 to 300 meters in various shooting positions. A sniper he was not, but he was very proficient with his weapon. The average deployment time for a soldier during the Gulf War was about 9.5 months. After only 3 months, John Muhammad would return home. The reason for his short deployment? Yet another mystery in this case. Like many returning soldiers, part of John would never return home.
A lot of hardships readjusting civilian life because, like I said, you over there in a combat zone and there's just so much uncertainty. Over there. So you kind of become, hyper vigilant, for lack of a better term. You always like looking around, or if you hear something, you're super alert. And in the real world, people just don't live like that.
The once jovial man that had once been described as the life of the party had become withdrawn, even from his wife, and would lash out at her for no reason at all.
Yeah, you don't want to really do a lot of meeting extra people and talking to people you don't have to. You kind of have a straight 1,000-yard stare, and you just kind of go through like that, and you don't really want to be bothered. And that's just not really the way people live. Typically people are going to interact with each other.
John remained a good father, but his marriage began to show stress fractures. The once joyful man that was the life of the party was no longer there. John would later be diagnosed with PTSD. Unfortunately, not much was known about the disorder at this time, and there was not much in the way of treatment for the condition.
Stress disorder, that is it just comes in different forms for so many different people. And like I said, it's all just based on the things you personally experienced, when you were, we call it downrange. So when you were in a combat environment. A lot of stress out there. A lot of stress. Like I said, they lobbing rockets and mortars at you, and there's essentially nothing you can do to protect yourself.
By 1999, the verbal and mental abuse became too much for Mildred to handle, and the couple would separate. But that didn't stop John. He would sometimes come back to the home in the dead of night and let himself in.
He would stand over the bed to listen if I was breathing. I opened my eye just to watch him go from one side of the bed to the other, stand up, and walk out the house.
Mildred knew exactly what John was capable of and what he had been trained to do.
He could make a weapon out of anything, and he was a hand-to-hand combat expert.
Mildred knew she needed help, but where could she turn? Mildred would turn to the court system for assistance. After hearing her story, a judge would grant her a lifetime restraining order against John Mohammed. John knew that this decision would affect his visitation with his children, and John was not about to let that happen. Shortly after the restraining order was put in place, John Mohammed would go to his kids' school and remove them without their mother's knowledge. Mohammed would take his children and flee to Antigua. It is here where he would meet a woman by the name of Una James and her 14-year-old son, Lee Boyd Malvo. Miss James was a Jamaican citizen living in Antigua, but her dream was to move herself and her son to America. When Miss James met John Mohammed, she thought it was a dream come true. Here was a man that could, for $3,000 apiece, provide fake identities for her and her son and help them illegally enter the U.S. Miss James came up with a plan. She would save $3,000, move to America, and begin to set up a life for her son. While James was working to earn another $3,000 to send for her son, Lee Malvo would stay with a family friend. The plan seemed to be going well at first. James earned the $3,000, paid Mohammed, and he helped her enter the U.S. by way of Florida. While Miss James was away, Malvo and Mohammed grew close. Lee spent a lot of his time with not only Mohammed, but his children as well. Mohammed's daughters even described him as being like another brother.
He was a brother. One day, my dad came home, and he was with him, and he said, "This is your new brother now." We were like, "Oh, okay." His name's Lee. "Okay, hi Lee." And we introduced ourselves and just went from there.
We got along, and everything was fine. He looked out for us whenever my dad was gone or anything like that. He was basically like another brother beside my real brother, John.
Back in Washington, Mildred was devastated by the absence of her children. She went to the police looking for help, but with John being the children's father, it was little the authorities could do. She even hired a private investigator, but that came up empty too. Meanwhile, another mother was becoming suspicious of John Mohammed. 4 months after paying for passage into the U.S. for her son, Lee was yet to join his mother in Florida. Miss James was shocked to find out that Lee was no longer living with the family friend, but instead was staying with John Mohammed. Lee was always looking for a strong male role model, and he found it in Mohammed.
As a former football coach and teacher, mentorship is something that is very important because of what it gives to not the mentor, but the mentee. You're there to help provide guidance to the mentee to help make their life better, to help guide them in a direction that puts them on a path for success.
And for a while, that is exactly what Muhammad did for the young Malvo. Lee saw a father who loved his kids, spent time with them, and took interest in their lives. He saw a man who financially supported his family. He probably didn't know that it was by illegal means. And this man had invited him in, treated him as one of his own, and surrounded him with a loving family. What Lee didn't see, and perhaps couldn't see, was the storm brewing inside of this man. A storm that would wrap Lee up and sweep him away. It would be a total of 6 months before Lee would reunite with his mother. But a big part of him would remain with Muhammad. And Lee never left Muhammad's mind either. Not even 1,500 or so miles would separate him from his new surrogate son. Muhammad kept in contact with Lee, calling him often. And Lee, he dreamt about the life he left behind in Antigua. John Muhammad had been making a living by selling fake identification to those who were seeking to enter the U.S. illegally. This was pretty lucrative for John. He had earned about $60,000 in just over a year. However, this money train would come to a halt when Antigua authorities got wind of what John was doing. John and his family would flee back to the U.S. When John and his kids arrived back in the U.S., it was not the American dream waiting on them, but police with more questions about his children. When John and the children re-entered the U.S., they found themselves in a homeless shelter, the Lighthouse Mission in Birmingham, Alabama. When Muhammad applied for government assistance for him and his children, red flags went up.
Got my writ of habeas corpus, which meant anywhere they found my children, they needed to pick them up and bring them back to me.
And that's exactly what happened. Police went to the Lighthouse Mission and removed the children from John. An emergency custody hearing was scheduled in Washington State. John showed up to the hearing expecting to be able to tell his side of the story. But he was told this was not the time for that.
Good morning, please be seated. Sir, if you'd raise your right hand, ma'am. Do you both solemnly swear or affirm that any testimony you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Sir, what is your name?
Sir, my legal name is John Alvin Muhammad.
Sir, what is your date of birth?
December 31st, 1960. Can you please tell me what's going on?
There is a parenting plan that was entered by the court on October 6, 2000, last year.
I'm not aware of it. So the children were never missing?
According to the court's order, they're going with mother.
Are you telling me the reason why I don't have my children and won't be able to keep my children because I don't have the proper paperwork yet?
The orders have said that mother has sole residential placement, care, and custody of the children. You do have an opportunity to express your side of the story for the court to hear it. All right?
And until it's done, I'm not able to see my children.
Your visitation is suspended.
A distraught John Muhammad left the courtroom that day. In his mind, this was an injustice that could not stand. Many believe this is when John Muhammad's diabolical plan began to form. He would return to Alabama, where he would contact the one person he knew he could trust. The one person he knew would follow him blindly. Lee Malvo. Muhammad would call Lee and tell him, "I need you, son." And that was all that was needed for Lee to leave his home and join Muhammad. Once Lee, now 17, was reunited with Muhammad, Muhammad told him, "In order to do what we have to do, you must become something else. Lee Malvo must die." Muhammad began to train Lee in the ways of war, physical conditioning, and Islam. Muhammad would have Lee play sniper video games and watch the movie The Matrix, all to desensitize him to the acts he would have him commit. The once doting father had now become a deranged drill sergeant, and Malvo had become his mad marksman in training.
And the manipulation comes from the mentor changing the focus of the efforts, not on making the mentee's life better, but on the mentor abusing that relationship for their own personal gain over making the mentee's life better. And fortunately, in my experience, it doesn't happen often, but obviously there are some circumstances where it does, and it's a severe violation of trust in a relationship where one person is depending on another, and that person is basically using them for their own personal gain.
And that's what we saw here. Muhammad had convinced Lee that they were on a mission to punish an unjust U.S. government. His true motives, even more selfish and deranged. By February 16th, 2002, Lee Malvo was ready for his first test. In better times, Isa Nichols was a family friend to the Muhammads. She was an accountant and had been hired by the Muhammads to crunch some numbers for John's auto repair shop. Her and Mildred had become fast friends, and when things soured in the Muhammad's household, it was Mildred who she stood behind. Isa even attended some of the custody hearings to show her support for her friend. In John's eyes, this made her an enemy. And now she would have to pay for being part of the system that took away his children. So, on the early evening of February 16th, 2002, John Muhammad would send Lee Boyd Malvo to her home, 45 in hand, to end her life. But it would not be Miss Nichols to open the door that day. Instead, it would be her niece, 21-year-old single mother of one, Kenya Cook. Miss Cook was staying with her aunt to escape an abusive relationship. She had planned on going back to school and opening her own restaurant. These dreams would be dashed as Lee leveled the .45 to her head and pulled the trigger. Sadly, Kenya Cook would not survive her injuries, and her child would have to grow up without their mother. Mildred had no idea that her friend and her friend's family had suffered this horrible event. That is, because by this time, Mildred had changed her name and moved across the country to Washington, D.C. After the first murder, John and Lee went on what can only be described as a crime spree, committing robberies and murders in several different states. Just over a month after the murder of Kenya Cook on March 19th, the pair would shoot and kill 60-year-old Jerry Taylor in Tucson, Arizona, as he played golf. On August 1st of the same year, the pair would strike again. 58-year-old John Gieta was attempting to change a flat tire when he was shot in the neck with a .22 caliber pistol by Malvo. Gieta would play dead while Malvo and another person believed to be Muhammad stole his wallet. Mr. Gieta would go on to survive this attack. September 5th, 2002. Malvo would shoot Paul LaRaffa 5 times in front of his restaurant in Clinton, Maryland. Like Gieta, LaRaffa would survive his encounter with these two madmen. The pair would also steal his laptop. 9 days later, the pair would strike again. 22-year-old Rupinda Abaroy, known to his friends as Benny, would be shot outside of a liquor store in Silver Springs, Maryland. He too would survive his injuries. The very next day, on September 15th, Rashad was shot, but he survived as well. September 21st, 41-year-old Million Wardamiriam is shot 3 times with the same .22 caliber handgun outside of an Atlanta liquor store. He would die from his injuries. Later the same day in Montgomery, Alabama, employee Kelly Adams and store owner Claudine Parker are both shot during a robbery. Ms. Parker would die from her injuries, and Adams would be seriously wounded. She would undergo 31 surgeries in a short 5 years before recovering. This was also the first attack where the Bushmaster AR-15 was used. There are other murders and robberies in over 10 states that authorities believe but cannot prove Lee and Muhammad are responsible for. One such case is that of Billie Jean Dillon, who was shot and killed in Denton County, Texas. Mr. Dillon was struck with a bullet from a high-powered rifle from a distance, the same MO as the sniper team. While John and Lee were on the road committing their crimes, the pair would often stay in shelters or with friends of Muhammad. One of these friends was Robert Holmes, a battle buddy from Muhammad's military days. The last time Muhammad visited Holmes, he had a young companion with him. Muhammad introduced Holmes to his young companion Lee Malvo, but something seemed off about that introduction. Nothing big, it was just what Muhammad had called the kid.
He introduced Lee to me, he said Lee was a sniper.
A sniper? This kid? Surely, this was just a nickname. Muhammad would boast about how Lee was a great shot, even better than he was. But sniper? Holmes would tuck this little bit of information away, just in case. There were other things too. Holmes noticed some changes in his once cheerful friend.
He was depressed and probably a little bit angry, but it's probably like controlled anger.
After staying with Holmes for a while, one morning Muhammad and Lee loaded their belongings into the car and prepared to leave. Muhammad told Holmes he had a lead on where his ex-wife had taken his kids.
He says, I pretty much know where Mildred's at. He said Mildred's in the D.C. area. It's just a matter of me pinpointing her.
And then Muhammad was off. Holmes watched his old friend drive away in that old blue Caprice. And what about that Caprice? It didn't look like much, but that old school Motor City classic was different, special. Remember when Mildred Muhammad said this?
He could make a weapon out of anything.
So let's talk about this now infamous car. A car that was just as much a part of this murderous plot as the two men who rode inside. This is where we will pick up next time on Split Seconds Active.